Okay, so let me introduce myself. I'm Paul Burns. I'm the Executive Director of VPIRG, the Vermont Public Interest Research Group. VPIRG is the largest consumer and environmental advocacy organization in Vermont, and we have a long history of working on government reform and fair elections, democracy issues generally. And so I'm really happy to be joined today by 6 of my colleagues who will each speak briefly here, and then we'll open it up to any questions that the journalists may have. So again, appreciate you all are certainly in the journalism crew more used to this than I am, and that we are, but thanks for joining us this morning. So let me begin with just a couple of brief remarks, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues. Our goal here is pretty simple. We want to protect public health and strengthen our democracy during this 2020 election cycle, which has been generally thought of as the most important election cycle in our lifetimes. I know we say that every time, but this is certainly true for many folks. Our starting point is that it is time now to learn the lessons that we can already from this pandemic. One of the chief lessons I think to take away is that a failure to plan can lead to some catastrophic results. Conversely, by planning ahead, we can mitigate the very serious harm that can come from this virus. And this is a time for us to be able to think ahead and to plan for an event that could bring together, not in one place, but in places around this state, more than 300,000 Vermonters, perhaps on a single day. To be clear, nobody knows what the world will look like exactly. Nobody knows what this virus threat will look like in November of this year. But it is for sure that it won't be gone. We will not be safe from possible harm. And there is broad speculation among medical professionals that there may be, in fact, a greater threat as we move into the fall. And it's also, I think, important to point out that we won't necessarily know months in advance. In other words, we may not know much more in August about what the virus threat looks like in November than we know today. But what we know for sure is that the threat is there, that it is possible, and that it could be substantial. And that this is therefore the time for us to plan and act accordingly to try to reduce that threat while preserving the really important, critical, fundamental right to vote. You've heard it many times, you'll hear it more today, but nobody should be risking their health in order to exercise their right to vote. And that is the kind of fundamental core belief, I think, that we are all kind of rallying around here. So remind you of a couple of statistics here. In a typical presidential election, we have about 320,000 voters in Vermont. About 320,000 voted in 2016, for instance. Approximately 30%, a little less than 30% of all of those people who vote in Vermont vote early, either at their polling place or through an absentee ballot process. So that's about 95,000 of those 320,000 voters. In order to reduce the threat at the polling places this year, we hope to maximize the participation of voters who can vote safely from home. That means voting by mail, and it means universal vote by mail systems in place. Our goal would be to have 200,000 more Vermonters voting by mail in November of 2020 than ever have before in Vermont. That would get us to a point where about 90% of Vermont voters, 90% of all those people voting in the November 2020 election would be voting by mail from the safety of their home. That, we think, is a reasonable goal to shoot for, to keep those voters safe, to keep the clerks safe, to keep all of those poll workers safe on election day, or at least safer, because you want to drive those numbers down of all of the people coming together to vote at those polling places on election day. So I just want to make sure that we have those figures in mind. What are we trying for here? There is no need to kind of stumble or scramble into the final days of this election when it comes to making vote by mail work. This is our chance to do it right. And to do it right, you need to move now. It's important for the Secretary of State to identify vendors, enter into contracts. It's important for those vendors to be able to know that this business is actually going to happen and come their way. Many of those are Vermont vendors, for instance. It's critically important that clerks can plan now, can work with their poll workers to set up safe systems, both for people who are coming in to vote at the polling place on election day and for the process of opening up those hundreds of thousands of ballots that would be coming in by mail. That's not something that you do on the fly in the final weeks of an election season. You do it now in order to do it right. So that's our goal. This coalition has come together around several different specific proposals. The first is to have universal vote by mail. That's every registered voter receiving a ballot in the mail with a postage paid return envelope, so that there are as few barriers as possible to participating in vote by mail. The second is that we preserve in-person voting options for those who may need or want that in the state. And the third is that the state officials engage in a very broad public education and outreach campaign, and all of the groups and businesses on this call and many, many others are ready, willing, and able to participate in that process. But again, the time is now to start that. I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to open things up to my colleagues here, and I'm going to start with Falko Schilling, representing the ACLU of Vermont. Falko, are you ready to go? There you go.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. This is my first virtual press conference, so thank you all for being here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Falko Schilling. I'm the Advocacy Director for the ACLU of Vermont, and we're here today because we want to say that no one should have to choose between their health and their vote. As we fight this pandemic in our communities, we need to protect our health and our civil liberties, including our fundamental right to vote. A simple step Vermont can take right now to reduce risk of disenfranchisement is to broaden access to voting by mail. Voting by mail is a common sense solution to protect our health. That's why officials from both parties in a wide range of states, including Alabama, Indiana, New Hampshire, New York, and West Virginia, have expanded voting by mail to all voters in their states. Vermont has been a leader in expanding access to the ballot box, and we need to continue this tradition. To ensure all Vermonters have the right to vote, the state should take the following actions before it's too late. 1, mail a ballot to all registered voters in advance of the general election in November. 2, make safe in-person voting available on election day. And 3, expand voter education so that all Vermonters know how they can safely cast their vote. In order to safeguard our health and our democracy, we must act now to save our elections by implementing these common sense solutions. No one in Vermont should have to choose between protecting their health and exercising their right to vote. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to pass it off to the next speaker.
Thanks, Falko. And next I'm going to recognize Kiah Morris, who former state representative you're all familiar with, now representing Rights and Democracy. Kiah?
Great, thank you. I appreciate everyone joining us today. This is a really important moment. So I think as we think about voting rights, there becomes a real necessity to bring to the forefront what it means for folks with different economic stratuses to be able to engage in the activity of voting within a democratic system. Our systems are currently not set up in a way that catches all. It's set up to privilege those who work typical 9-to-5 jobs, have the flexibility to be able to leave and to drive, to commute to a place of voting, to do that in-person voting that we all associate with on an election day. Now, being able to have that access to mail-by voting sends a very clear message about who counts and who does not count. So when we're restricting the ability for working folks to be able to engage in a democratic process in a time when we're being told very important messages about how to keep ourselves safe, it lets us us know very clearly about whose votes are actually disposable and whose votes are valued. There are some real implications to that we cannot ignore right now. We have to recognize fully that there is going to be a second wave. We are not done with this crisis yet at all. And even these gentle measures to try to reopen up our economy and reopen back up our communities is going to increase risk levels and reinfection levels. And so we may have to have a retraction. So we don't have a plan in place now for how to ensure that everyone gets to vote into the future. We're going to be behind the 8 ball and disenfranchising people unnecessarily. I want to bring to the forefront about the fact that much of what we do from Rights and Democracy and what many of the people on this call are trying to do are bringing our most marginalized folks from the margins to the center of our democratic processes. And this is a key way that folks understand how our government works and a key way that they're able to express their voices in that moment. So we have to hold that as sanctiment. I also want to be able to say that there's really no justification for not providing a mechanism to do vote by mail, which will reach everyone, right? When we have the solutions at hand and folks are working very diligently on that process, and we have the funding and the support of our congressional delegation in doing so. We have been given a clear message from the federal government through the passage of the funds that have come for our recovery that this is a part of how we need to think about a new world in the time of COVID. We should not ignore that or to abandon that for any partisan reasons at this point in time. There's really no legitimate justification for it. So as a grassroots organization, it's crucial for us to make sure that those who do not see themselves as engaging or who are asking questions as to why this moment is failing them, why our state is not able to meet their needs, that they can be a part of creating those solutions moving forward, and voting is a direct way to do that. So we'll fight for that to the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kiah. Next, I want to recognize Mark Hughes from Justice for All.
Thank you, Paul. I want to first just say that at Justice for All, some of the work that we're doing across communities and throughout Vermont has been to address racial disparities not just within the criminal justice system, but also across all systems of state government, as indicated in the Act 54 report that was delivered by the Attorney General and the Human Rights Commission Executive Director in December of 2017, indicating that there were racial disparities across housing, education, employment, economic services, health services access, to include the criminal justice system. So one of the things that we're doing during this COVID crisis is we're trying to address the impact that the COVID crisis has placed on these existing disparities and the adverse impact that has caused additional stress to just folks across the state in ways that I don't have time to talk about. Insufficient access to stimulus or even employment development opportunities, disproportionate education, technology, language and learning capabilities, lack of hazardous pay, personal protection equipment, testing, so-called people of color, essential workers, lack of access to civic and political related information and updates, disparate justice system with newly introduced avenues of pretense for law enforcement across the state, and so forth and so on. I have a daughter who has COVID-19 right now. I have a niece who's in prison, in federal prison, who has lupus and also has diabetes, okay? I have a son who's incarcerated right now. So these are very difficult times. We're so-called opening the door here, this incremental restoration of the state full services capacity. Great. We already know that we're going to go back because there's no solution out there, okay? There's so many things that are hitting us from so many different ways, and Black and brown people are at the epicenter of all of this. So why, Mr. Governor, do we have to have a conversation about voting today? Do your job, do your job, do your job. It is our right to vote, okay? There are more Black and brown people who can't vote in this nation than there were slaves in 1850. We don't need to have this conversation today. Do your job, make it happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I now want to recognize Ed Paquin from Disability Rights Vermont.
Hello. As Paul said, I work with Disability Rights Vermont, and we investigate abuse and neglect of people with disabilities, but we also advocate for processes that will bring them the same opportunities as the rest of us in society have access to. I think we need to really realize that Vermonters right now are going through a lot with remarkable cooperation, and despite incredible loneliness, fear, and economic hardships, we've pulled together to put the lives of our brothers and sisters above all other considerations. So regardless of the challenges, when we come together as a civil society to chart the course of our democracy, we should all, regardless of disability, race, or any other consideration, be able to safely cast our ballots. Let's make sure that every registered voter gets a ballot and that every qualified Vermonter has the opportunity and the means to cast a vote in a safe manner. For people with disabilities, that means that they have access to whatever means of reading and marking the ballot that works best to them. And if no means remotely fills that bill, then safe access to in-person voting with legitimate and safe assistance can be available. And I think come November, we could make the best turnout that we've ever seen happen in the state of Vermont. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ed. Two more brief speakers, and we've got Lili Platt up next from Vermont Youth Lobby. Lili.
Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. My name is Lili Platt, and I'm a senior at Harwood Union High School in Duxbury, Vermont, and I'll be attending Middlebury College this fall. In addition to schoolwork, athletics, a part-time job, and working with the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants in Colchester, Vermont, I'm also an organizer for the Vermont Youth Lobby, which is a grassroots coalition of young people from across the state working together in partnership with our legislators, community members, nonprofits, and other organizations to affect the change younger generations are demanding. Like thousands of other high school and college students in Vermont, this is going to be my first opportunity to vote. I'm excited, and I won't let anything get in my way, but that doesn't mean that I or anyone should have to risk their health or their life in order to vote. I know a lot of people want to protect the tradition of in-person voting, but 30% of voters already vote early or vote by mail, and for my generation, we don't have that tradition. Young Vermonters want to cast our ballots safely and securely without putting ourselves or others at risk. The best way to do that in 2020 is to vote by mail. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions when we get to the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Lili. And now finally, Morgan Nichols from Main Street Alliance will bring some of the business perspective to this conversation. Morgan?
Hi, Paul. Thank you all so much for doing this and for having me here today. I'm going to be really brief. My colleagues have outlined everything that the small business community stands for, and we want to continue to support all of your efforts for this for a vote by mail campaign in 2020. Main Street Alliance of Vermont and our membership of over 700 plus small business owners strongly support our Secretary of State and his recommendation for a vote by mail solution for our November election. We don't have time to delay in making this decision. We must act now to properly educate our communities and be able to have all the tools necessary to be ready to be able to hold a safe election in November. And like I said, all of my colleagues have outlined all of the incredible reasons that this shouldn't be a decision that is a hard one to make. Everyone has this right, and we need to be able to do it in a safe way. So thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. That's the speakers list. And I wanted to see if we have any questions from media folks. Stuart, I see you're in a vehicle. I don't want to lose you wherever you are. I wonder if you have anything that you want to ask.
Have you unmuted? I've
Yes.
always been the host. Okay, yeah, you didn't grant permission to record this. So while your speeches were great, I couldn't record.
We have recorded that, and I'm sure we'd be happy to make that available to you. I apologize for the failure to allow you to do so.
Okay, if you can do that, then I'm good. I guess the only question is timing. That seems to be the governor's thing. Is there a deadline by which you think he should, other than yesterday, is there effectively a deadline facing the Secretary of State in order to pull this off?
I would say that, you know, we're kind of looking to the Secretary of State for guidance on this. It is their belief that they need to move very rapidly. So what, another week? I mean, the question in my mind is what more information does the governor need? The Secretary of State's office, they've done their work. They've identified a path forward here. And what we're hearing from the governor is that he wants to wait until after the primary in August. Let me be clear. That is utterly irresponsible at this point, and it will needlessly jeopardize public health because you cannot run the most effective vote-by-mail program by waiting until late August to hit go. I cannot think of any reason why the governor would want to delay things that long. You don't want to do that to the clerks. Why do that to the poll workers? Why do that just to the citizens of this state who could otherwise be planning to participate? And all of these organizations should be planning to work with our members, our customers, our supporters, you know, to show them how to do it and how to do it effectively. You know, that means you got to know how to fill out that ballot, putting one envelope inside the other. Let's avoid all those problems. Most states that have gone to vote by mail have done so over a period of years, you know, in planning and preparation. We're now talking about truncating that into 6 months, and he'd like to do it in a few weeks. You know, it just makes no sense. If you want to succeed, make the decision now.
Are you saying you'd like to, or would you propose becoming a sort of a permanent vote-by-mail state?
I don't think that decision needs to be made right now. But it seems that you want to make, if you're going to use vote by mail in 2020, then better to make the decision early in order to give it the greatest chance to succeed. And if it succeeds in 2020, there's an awful lot of, I think, a growing body of evidence to suggest that it is the best way to hold elections moving forward that allows for most people to participate. You know, the study out just earlier this week of Colorado showed that they believe they've had a 9% voter participation increase that they attribute to moving to the vote by mail system there in 2013. So again, what we're talking about here is a way to keep people safe and strengthen our democracy. And we've got the money to do it. You know, as Kiah mentioned, I cannot imagine what the governor is dawdling over at this point, but it is bordering on reckless to fail to move forward, I think, immediately with this decision. Okay, let's see if there are any other questions that folks may have. Yeah, Kevin, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I think I understand where you're coming from on this, Paul, but I want you to put as sharp a point as you can on why the governor's idea about buying the envelopes, buying the paper, inking the contracts with the mail houses and such, now with the federal money, and then holding off on the final decision about whether to actually do the mail-in ballot process after the primary is so problematic. He seems to be trying to say, let's plan for this, but then maybe not have to do it if things get better. Why is that flawed in your mind?
I'm happy to open this up, but my take is that, and I think the Secretary of State's been pretty clear about this, they have a very small elections office staff there. They shouldn't be planning at this point to run an election in 2 different ways. And that's what the governor is asking them to do right now through August. And it is, you cannot plan successfully to run an election in 2 different ways between now and then. And why put that burden on all of these clerks, many of whom work part-time around the state? They're trying to identify their poll workers who are worried, frankly, for their health right now. Why not give them the assurances that we're going to do everything we can to protect their health by encouraging as many people as possible to participate in voting in a way that doesn't involve them coming to the polling place? I mean, and for organizations and businesses like ours, this is our chance to go out and educate people about how that process works and to get about that work now. And it undercuts all of those efforts to say, by the way, we might not do it at all, and we'll tell you more in August. And frankly, I didn't mention again, the vendors, many of these are Vermont businesses that will be doing that printing or the mailing house. Why not give them an assurance right now that they're going to have this important business in the fall? This seems like a win-win-win. You know, it helps the clerks, the poll workers to stay safe. It helps Vermonters to stay safe and participate in the election. And yeah, it could actually help some Vermont businesses who desperately need good work by participating in this safer voting process. There's all sorts of reasons to make the decision now in order to make the process work more effectively. I just can't think of very many reasons not to.
Well, one of the only other things I've heard from him and his people that makes any sense is he's saying that it would be very confusing to be running a public education campaign about the general election vote by mail process prior to the primary, which will not be a vote by mail process. He's trying to argue that 2 different types of elections will be very confusing for voters. That seems to maybe have a ring of truth to it.
I think probably everybody on this call would agree it would be preferable to have 6 more months to plan for this and to have a universal vote by mail process in place maybe for the primaries as well. But that's not where we are now. But the Secretary of State is, in my opinion, doing what is, I think, the next best thing, which is to send out the invitation to participate in the absentee voting process and to encourage people to participate that way. So from an educational standpoint, we'll be doing much the same work around that. It's just that you've got one more hurdle in place for people to participate in the vote by mail process for the primary. So I don't think, you know, that's not a reason not to go forward with making the decision certain in November, in my opinion. Again, happy to have others comment on that.
Thank you, Paul. If I may, I think what we need to clarify here, Vermonters are confused about everything. We are not getting clear messages about any aspect of our lives as they exist right now because we are in an unprecedented time. It is irresponsible to expect your average Vermonter to navigate a complex system like this without a clear roadmap to their ability to cast a vote. We cannot continue to expect Vermonters to have that level of technical expertise when they're not even understanding how to register to vote in most iterations in a normal election cycle. Everything is turned upside down right now. So it feels not only irresponsible, but it feels deliberate. And we have to give Vermonters something that they can look forward to, that they can understand, and that they can have confidence in. If it is not our democracy and the exercise of our right to vote, then what are we doing? Really?
I think the governor is trying to argue that this would represent a return to normalcy. So he's trying to say that everything is topsy-turvy right now. We are trying to get the state back to a place of normal, and this is the best way to maybe do that. But I see your point as well, Kiah.
Ed, do you want to weigh in here?
Am I muted? Or
you're good.
No. Okay, there we go. I'm going to give a little bit of an inside sort of perspective here. as I'm also on the Board of Civil Authority in the town of Barry, and we are about to run an election in early June. And we have sent, and I think this may be sort of the way to look at the primary, we've sent a postcard to to all the registered voters on the checklist, and explaining to them how to get an absentee, or not an absentee, an early voting, to vote by mail, how to vote by mail. And we've explained a mechanism whereby they will be able to come in and vote in early June without getting out of their vehicle. And it's quite an interesting thing that's been set up. And I think, but it takes a lot of planning. And I can tell you, as a poll worker who's over 66 by 1 year, there is legitimate consideration that to think that we are going to have a normal election is just plain unrealistic. We may very well, and I certainly hope this is the case, see a reduction in, and maybe an almost a disappearance in the number of COVID-19 cases by the time of November. However, to think that it's going to be safe to have the large groups of people passing by the way we have in a normal election, it's very unrealistic. There's not going to be an inoculation for this by then, and we saw how fast this came in with, you know, relatively few people, and boom, next thing you knew, there was a community spreading of a virus that is incredibly dangerous. To think that that's going to be gone enough to make for a normal election process, it's just plain unrealistic.
Yeah, Kit.
This might be a question better for the governor, but I'll throw it out to anyone here. In terms of, the governor has said that he doesn't really want to get in the middle of this. I think he said this on Tuesday, and yet he is. I'm just curious from any of your point of views, why is he getting in between the Secretary of State and this voting issue?
Well, I can just, as you know, I'm sure the legislature and the emergency legislation passed in March gave kind of joint authority to the Secretary of State and the governor here. So technically, he needs to sign off on the Secretary of State's plan. If he doesn't want to be involved, I think I would strongly encourage him not to be involved and to get out of the way. That's a simple solution to his dilemma.
Thanks.
I mean, yeah, okay. So, and just one more thing on Kevin's point about the return to normal. I think I just echo Ed's remarks there. We can hope for a return to normal and pray for a return to normal, but you can't wish it to be so. And it is irresponsible not to plan for something that is less than normal.
I have a quick comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
So if the explanations that the governor has given on this subject all fall short in your minds or are lacking, does anyone in the room have a feeling that there are other reasons that have not yet been expressed, such as partisan advantage or other concerns about voter fraud? I take that last part back. He's explicitly said he's not concerned about voter fraud, but absent any of the other explanations he's given as being convincing to any of you, does anyone have any thoughts about what the real reasons might be for him to be opposing this at this juncture? Given that, as Kit's story pointed out so nicely last week, the Republicans across the nation have been opposed to mail-in ballot processes.
Does anyone want to raise a hand to comment on that?
It's a bit of a leading question, but I want that question to be addressed by if people feel they want to. No takers.
Ed, I see a hand raised.
Okay, I don't want to make it a partisan issue, and I will give the governor the most credit I can and say that this has been such his position. He's been in such a difficult position that I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say that this hasn't been where the focus of that he's been able to give it because of so many other things going on. And I'm just here to say that if we look at this logically in a nonpartisan way, everybody needs to be able to vote safely. Let's just do it the right way. Let's just do it in a way that makes sense for people. Now, and so I'm not going to try and second guess his motives.
And I don't have any greater insights there. There have been studies done in the 5 states that have this in place that suggests that there is not a great partisan advantage to any political party here. This last study to come out a week ago from Colorado did suggest while there was an overall 9% increase in voter participation, there was a particular even greater increase in participation from groups and communities that have been traditionally faced greater barriers to voting. So people of color or lower income and so forth. And I don't know, you know, that information is out there and perhaps it could worry somebody. Certainly the president has expressed his great fear that no Republican will ever be elected again. But the Republican Secretary of State in Oregon, which has had, you know, vote by mail for many years, expresses no such concern. The Republican governor of Ohio expresses no such concern. So I think it is misplaced if this really is at its core an unspoken partisan interest on the part of the governor or some advisor in his ear. What the winners here are voters and poll workers and clerks who can exercise their rights and their responsibilities and jobs with reduced fear. And so I'm very hopeful that the governor will come around on this and will give it a green light soon.
Thanks.
Any other questions that folks have? If not, then let me say thanks so much to everybody participating, my colleagues and journalists. Thanks for your great work. And obviously, you know where to track us down if you need to.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.